Welcome to Stack Moxie Real-Time Monitoring Setup, where we're going to walk through how to set up a real-time monitor within your instance. The first thing you need to do is log into Stack Moxie. The second thing is you need to pull up the instructions under the help documents right here. And you're going to find those instructions under your real-time monitoring link. Okay. The first thing that we want to do is build our scenario, and we're going to build from scratch. It's really important to understand what your strategy behind testing is when you're building your real-time monitor. And for this, we're going to test that minimum data requirements are being met across our form fills in Marketo. And that's to ensure that all of our leads can sync to Salesforce as expected. Now, there's two ways to validate in Marketo, and that's using the email address or the lead ID. Today, we'll be practicing with the lead ID. So our system starts in Marketo. And the first thing we want to do is think of this as the customer journey. And the first thing we want to do when we get in Marketo is check a field on a Marketo lead by ID. Now, if you're using email address, you're going to use the check a field on a Marketo lead token. But since we're doing this by ID, we're going to start with the by ID step. Now you want to drop in your token from webhook ID. This is how we identify the lead record in Marketo. Next, you want to select your partition. We're going to start in our default partition. Next, we want to select the field we're validating. So for our minimum data requirements, we're going to validate that all of our forms are coming in with email address that should be set. And then we're going to check another field. This is going to automatically populate the from webhook ID and the partition. The next field that we're going to check as a minimum data requirement is country. And we just want to make sure country is set on the record. And finally, we want to make sure that all of our forms follow a lead source that has a pick list that matches our lead source value. So we're going to check another field. We're going to select lead source. Should be one of. And then we're going to select our tokens. So these tokens can be used to match values. So we want to make sure our lead source is one of our UTM source values since these list match. Okay, so now when a lead comes in, we're making sure they have an email address, they have a country value, and they have a lead source that matches one of our lead source pick list values. Now we can save our scenario. We're going to save our scenario with RTM in it because this is how reporting is pulled. And this is for MDRs. So we're going to make sure that we have that listed. And this is our version 2. Next, we're going to select our folder. So for this, I'm going to put this in my demo scenarios folder. And then I'm going to select my alerts. And my alerts are going to go to my marketing ops team. And now we're going to save and view. Okay. One other thing to keep in mind, if you want this to be added to your dashboard, because real-time monitoring will not be added to your dashboard automatically, you do need to select the status dashboard. So we're going to go ahead and select that to make sure this falls onto our dashboard when we're done. Okay. So now that we have our scenario built, we can build our webhook in Marketo. So now we're going to go into Marketo. We're going to go to our admin section and scroll down to webhooks. We're going to go to webhook actions, create new webhook, and we're going to name this RTM MDR for Stack Moxie V2. Next, we're going to go into our instructions, and we're going to scroll down to our section, which tells us where we need to put the webhook data. So you're going to find that under creating a webhook in Marketo. So the first step is to copy the URL. So now we're going to go back into our admin section and copy the URL. What you're going to see in the URL, and you don't want to include the comma, is an org ID and a scenario ID. So now we're going to go back into Stack Moxie, and we're going to pull our organization ID, which is this long ID in the middle of your URL. Go ahead and hit copy, and then you want to paste over that org ID in the webhook. Okay. Next, we want our scenario ID. So we're going to go back to our scenario. We're going to copy the last 5 digits of the scenario ID. So if you have more than 5 digits, copy whatever digits are in here. That is the ID of your scenario. And we're going to copy it into the scenario ID. Okay. Now that part's done. The request type is going to be post. And now we need our template. So we're going to go back into the instructions, and we're going to go to payload template, and we're going to take the second payload template for webhook ID. We're going to copy this and drop it into our template. Now, if you're using email address, you're going to want to use the one that's above it for the email address value. Okay. Our request token encoding is going to be JSON. Our response type is also going to be JSON. And now we're going to hit create. Now we're going to hit back onto our webhook, and we're going to go to webhook actions one more time, and we're going to set a custom header. Now we're going to go back into our instructions, and under custom headers, follow what our authorization is. So we're looking for authorization. So we're going to add the first header is authorization, and the value is going to be bearer with your API token. So this is how you pull your API token. We're going to go back into Stack Moxie. We're going to go under settings, and we're going to pull an API token under my account. So I'm going to generate a token. I'm going to name it correctly with the system that I'm engaging with. So this is going to be Marketo. And hit generate a token. You do want to copy this token because once you X out of here, it is gone forever. Now we're going to go back into Marketo, and we're going to add our token with 1 space after bearer and hit save. Now we're going to click back on our webhook, go to webhook actions, set custom header, and we're going to add another custom header. We're going to go back into our instructions, and we're going to add our content type. Here, and the value is going to be application JSON. And then we're going to hit save. Now your webhook is set up and ready to go. Now we're going to create the trigger that fires the webhook. So we're going to go into marketing activities. We're going to look for our Stack Moxie folder. And we're going to create a new smart campaign. We're going to call this 02 Stack Moxie trigger for MDR 2 and hit create. Okay, so now we're going to go to our smart list, and our trigger is going to be form fills because we're checking that any of our forms that have been deployed must have these minimum requirements on them to ensure that they can sync to Salesforce. So we're going to say our trigger is fills out form. Now we would say form is any, but there's a couple of forms that we want to disregard. So we're going to say form does not contain unsubscribe or email unsubscribe form or our email preference form. Okay. Next, under our flow step, we're going to add a 5-minute wait because we do have values that are set on the record after post submission. So we do want to put a little bit of wait time in there to let the lead process as expected. Next, we want to call our webhook. So we're going to select our webhook and then choose our V2. And now our trigger campaign is ready to go. We just have to schedule it. There's one thing to keep in mind when you're doing this, and that is volume. Now, Stack Moxie can handle a lot of volume, but what we want to do is respect the Marketo API, which can only manage so many API calls at a time. And the way we manage that is by adding a random sample. So if you're expecting more than 1,000 leads to process through your forms a day, we do recommend adding a random sample. So you can do that by adding a choice and saying, if random sample is 25%, then call our webhook. And we move our default choice. So you really want to try to stay around 1,000 leads per webhook a day, just to make sure that we're respecting APIs. You can absolutely check more than that, but you do want to make sure that the volume is dispersed so that you can ensure that there are no errors from the API on the Marketo side. Now we're going to schedule our scenario. And it's ready to go. Now there's a really easy way to test your webhook before launching. Very simply, you want to create a new smart campaign, and we're going to reuse this every time we launch a new real-time monitor. So we're just going to create one and then reuse it. So we're going to call it our RTM test. Okay. Under our smart list, we're going to say person is created. We're going to add a filter of email address contains. We're going to add a filter of email address contains. At this is just.automatest.com. And then under our flow step, we're going to call our webhook. So remember, this is just to test that our webhook is set up correctly and that we're getting a 200 response code. And you can use this every time you're testing a webhook to launch, just to make sure it's working as expected. Now we're going to schedule this to run. Okay. Now we can go back into Stack Moxie, click on Create Scenario, and we're going to go from scratch, and we're going to send a test lead right into our system to test that webhook. So the system starts in Marketo, and we're going to create or update a Marketo lead. So now we want to set the fields in the default that we're testing in. So we're testing in our default partition. We're going to set the email address on the record. Then we're going to set the country field. And finally, we're going to set our lead source field. And we're going to say it's going to come from, just as a test, pay per click. Okay, so now we can say save and run. Okay, the lead was created. Now we can go back into Marketo and check that the lead actually processed as expected. And here's our lead record. Let's go ahead and look at the response code. The response code is 200, so this webhook is now working. We want to make sure we deactivate our testing smart campaign because we only use it when we're testing our webhooks. And we know that this webhook is now ready to go. I can actually go back into Stack Moxie, go to my demo scenario, or go to my scenario, and watch as that lead passes through the system. And here is our lead record. And everything passed except lead source because it was the wrong value. So this is how we can test minimum data requirements across your stack based on form fills and how you set up a webhook to monitor in real time.